Hello, and welcome to our lesson on crisis management. This segment will cover the role of crisis managers. The role of crisis managers. A crisis stimulates a network of communications between internal and external stakeholders, and the best crisis managers are community builders, designing, creating, and maintaining appropriate social relationships among project participants. This encapsulates the contemporary idea that organizations are self-organizing social systems comprising a multitude of interdependent, culturally diverse people with varied and changing interests who respond differently and unpredictably to managerial actions. From this perspective, management is no longer seen as a mechanical, regulatory activity designed to control some objective and static scene, but as a social activity that involves coordinating purposeful individuals who are embedded in complex and constantly changing social networks. The networks tie parts of an organization into a coherent whole by providing channels through which information flows and new ideas are spread. They are the central mechanism through which managers must work to achieve integration, coordination, and cooperation. Social structure and crisis management efficiency. The concept of centrality explains the link between the structure of people's relationships and crisis management efficiency. Centrality refers to the degree to which information flow is centered around one or a few individuals in a communication network. Low centrality organizations are characterized by no leader, high activity, and slow problem solving, but high satisfaction. In this type of organization, when the problem complexity increases, the efficiency of various patterns completely reverses. The central person becomes overloaded with information, and peripheral people are less willing to accept the solution offered by the central person. In these conditions, crisis management efficiency is influenced by management's ability to control the structure of people's communication patterns. Therefore, organizations must consider various dimensions of communication structure that are important in a crisis management setting. Formal and informal communication structures. At the most basic level, communication structures are categorized as formal or informal. Formal communications during a project crisis are determined primarily by employment contracts that bind project participants together. The contracts set down prescriptive procedures designed to dictate the patterns of interaction of organizational members, thereby imposing an element of predictability in a situation where managerial control is naturally threatened. These procedures are also designed to ensure a rapid response to crises by keeping information channels free from irrelevant information and by defining the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Standardized procedures are most helpful when the nature of the tasks is simple. Contractual rules and procedures diminish during a crisis when task complexity and time pressures increase. They become restrictive and counterproductive by removing people's autonomy. During a crisis, a gap can open between what workers consider to be a legitimate and effective way of dealing with a situation and what formal procedures prescribe. The tendency in such situations would be for formal procedures to be bypassed and for people's patterns of communication to revolve around common interest groups and friendships. The dangers of contracts as a means of control. The network of communications that emerges in response to a project crisis has a significant informal element that could be dangerous if managers rely too much on contracts as a means of control. Contracts, however well drafted, are no substitute for good management. Managers facing a project crisis must ensure that formal procedures complement informal systems and recognize that a successful outcome may depend on their willingness to release people from potentially restrictive rules and procedures. By considering the possibility of crisis situations, managers may choose to include the emergency option as an intermediate step in making traditional contracts more flexible with a minimum risk of exploitation. In essence, the emergency option is a separate clause that can be legally incorporated into traditional project contracts, enabling parties to mutually agree to opt out of normal contractual procedures for a specified period in order to cope with a crisis. If one party abuses this trust, Then there is a facility for any party to unilaterally return the project to a formal mode. Organizational groups and factions. Groups perform many important functions during a crisis, such as enabling people to solve tasks of much greater magnitude and complexity than they would be able to tackle alone. Groups also provide for people's social, identity, and belonging needs, and can represent an important source of power in negotiations. The roles people play within and between groups and factions are very important to managers, as the liaison and bridge individuals are the people who link two or more factions and are members of multiple factions. Liaisons and bridges perform important linkage functions in organizations, and their removal destroys its connected unity. Their identification by a crisis manager is particularly important because they can be used to prevent communication breakdowns and to mediate among groups of opposing interests. The dangers of groups. While groups can perform many useful functions during a crisis, they can also be at their most dangerous. Groups can have a capacity for producing a special, subtle tyranny that can damage communications, slow down decision-making, produce compromise decisions, and suppress creativity and innovation. There is also a powerful influence a group can exert over its members. Group norms can cause people to blindly exhibit almost tribal behavior that their personality and wider society would normally suppress. It would seem that during a crisis, when effective communication, open-mindedness, creativity, and flexibility are most valuable, groups could be at their most dangerous. This is the end of this segment of our lesson. In the next segment, we will continue discussing the role of crisis managers. This course is presented to you by South Europe College. Thank you for listening, and see you on our next segment.